Welcome to Humanities Values. I am here with Jeff Fullington. He is a peer counselor in Washington, working mostly with people on the autistic spectrum and as well working through trauma. Jeff is really interested in building community, which is how he and I met, particularly online and in person, kind of that hybrid model that most of us probably are aware of in relation to work. But this is, of course, more fun. And it is all under the brand of New World Chaos. So, welcome, Jeff.
Thank you. Welcome. Hi.
Oh, we're good. So, Jeff, you and I, frankly, just have a good time chatting. So, we figured we'd share the joy with any number of other people who decide to listen. And so, with that in mind, I know I've seen a little bit of what New World Chaos kind of stands for, but how about we start with explaining what that means for you and, what does the brand look like? What are you looking to see and building for the future?
Okay. Well, the short answer is I have no idea. That's why I love the brand name because it describes us perfectly. Nemo, my podcast
Awesome.
partner, came up with it and it just stuck. And we really are in chaotic times. We're transitioning to some kind of post-COVID new world, and it is chaotic for a lot of people. So I think it just fits. And I see other communities online or statements online popping up with the same theme of chaos and new, like we're entering some new paradigm or dynamic. So it just seems timely. Basically, it's a bunch of things. It's a Discord server that we interact on, and
Mhm.
from there we coordinate Zoom activities and events and meetings and classes and trainings and workshops and whatever else people come up with. It's a very dynamic, creative community. We're drawing a lot of enthusiastic, bright, creative people that are jumping in and contributing like their piece to it. So it's kind of a container for all that. It's a hub, it's an incubator. We have a podcast. We used to do it live about once a week, but I think it's kind of transitioning into just whenever there's an interesting guest or topic. We have a little team of 4 or 5 of us that host, so one or two of us will hop on and do something. Um, I'm trying to grow the community, like the number. I'm trying to get people more involved in the Discord, more involved in interactions. So it's right now it's virtual, but the idea is to find the people. Like here in Washington State, we have several of us, and so getting us together locally and start doing local events. We want to plan a hiking camping trip soon for local Washingtonians and whoever else wants to show up, and then finding a way to encourage people to do that where they are. So, like in South Dakota, you can find the people that align with your values there and create some kind of little local hub that can connect to the big global virtual one that we're building. I used to be a meetup organizer. I had a big outdoors group in New Orleans before I moved here. Um,
Mhm.
and so I'm using a lot of those meetup principles too. Meetup was designed to find each other online and then transfer it in person to some event or activity.
Right. Okay. So essentially, you're trying to, let's see, almost recreate Facebook without the big brotherness of it.
Oh, that would be so nice. I'm Cajun, and there's nothing we love more than bringing people together to have a good time. And so I'm doing it in the spirit of that. Like the more people I can get together to work on creative project, I call it a community for rebels, misfits, thinkers, and problem solvers, or creative problem solvers, because that's what we end up doing. And so the more people I can
Awesome.
bring together to like solve the problems that need to be solved. I took a workshop
Mhm.
with a songwriting workshop when COVID first started, and the facilitator made the point over and over that artists are our creative problem solvers, and we need more artists and creative
Mm.
people to step up, particularly at this time, and kind of figure out the direction we want to go as a species or a vision for ourselves as a species. So I'm trying to attract those people, the problem solvers, and the people that want to have fun doing it too. And that's what it seems to
That,
be attracting. So I'm just going to keep doing what I'm
that,
doing right now.
yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think that's really what kept drawing us together. I think we've known each other for almost a year maybe now.
I think we met through CTA, which I joined
Yeah.
October or beginning of November. So whatever that
Okay. It's almost a year.
comes to.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, and I know we share that love of creating community, particularly community of, the misfits, the people that, are outside the beaten path, the ones that probably get a kick out of challenging status quo, which oddly enough, here we are, two guys in our own places, claiming we're going to, challenge the status quo, which might strike people a little weird. Like, wait, you are the status quo, which is in fact one of the things that, brings us, yeah, which in fact brings us together is exactly to poke at those kinds of blanket assumptions.
Well, I'm going to challenge that I'm the status quo. I've never been the
I
status
I
quo.
would guess so.
And
Yes.
I guess until moving here, I say all the time in the South, I was a sissy, a faggot, a gay, and here I'm the big scary male, like the white male ogre that terrorizes everybody. And
Uh,
I didn't change a single thing about myself. I just switched context. So
right.
I'm not used to being the status quo at all. And it's not,
Yeah.
or I don't
No.
think of it as challenging the status quo because I'm not
Hmm.
consciously challenging anything. I'm just being myself. And so growing up gay, just existing as a gay person was challenging the
Hmm.
status quo. Existing as an autistic person is challenging the status quo. So
Hmm.
I guess just existentially, I'm a challenge to a lot of people's status quos, but it's not intentional. I'm just trying to be who I am authentically. And I'm also an Enneagram 8, if anybody is familiar with the Enneagram, and it's called the Challenger. Like we're
Hmm.
hardwired to challenge things. So.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, and that's, it's interesting because, that challenge piece has been part of the conversations that you and I tend to get into because I will explain something or I'll, put forth an opinion or whatever. And and I'll make, even recently we had a, chat about, I think it was trauma, and I made some comment about, you know, emotions, and this is how people are, and you're like, maybe only in like your, as far as the largest, sense of community, like the norm in the sense of here's what the largest number of people tend to experience this is at, but you're coming at it from a very different perspective. And frankly, it helped me just kind of sit back and go, right, okay, how does this work? And kind of checking in my own assumptions. Not that there was a sense of judgment about it. It's just recognizing that how one appears and how one frames their existence is going to be not necessarily the same as anybody else, which, and then how other people then perceive us, which you're already heavily alluding to in the sense of coming from the South as a Cajun going, I was the aberration, to now coming up here going, wait, you're now the status quo and you're the one that we now need to be afraid of. And it's like, wait a minute, what the
And
hell changed?
and as the status quo, you're still the aberration because the status quo is now the aberration in a lot of
Mm-hmm.
circles. So I don't think it's changed this sense of being an aberration. Like these are labels that mean nothing to me internally. I have no internalized sense of any of them. I
Yeah.
do want to say that I enjoy and appreciate being challenged just as much as I challenge other people. And when I do challenge, it's
Mm-hmm.
not intentional, but when something doesn't make sense or I have to make sense before I can move forward in a conversation. So a lot of it comes from me just trying to keep up in the moment with the understanding of what the conversation is. And so a lot of it comes from that. And as some I'm so used to being the outlier. So as an outlier,
Mm-hmm.
people that operate off of statistical norms or basic norms or social mainstream norms, those almost never apply to me. So I'm so used to being in situations, and this is probably true for many outliers, where
Mm-hmm.
we just show up in a setting and already everything's a challenge. It's a challenge. The norms are a challenge to us. We're a challenge to the norms. So I guess being able to work with outliers in general is that's the skill set that I've developed. That's the skill set that people that have been able to work successfully with me have had to develop. That's the skill set I have to develop to work with the clients I work with. I was a special education student and teacher. That's all about how to work with outliers. So I guess
Hmm.
just knowing that we exist, and that there are the tools it takes to interact and work with us may be different from the tools that you're used to having to use with mainstream society, but there's no value. It's not a moral issue.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, and that is an interesting, which is, of course, a topic we've talked about quite often, is this kind of moralizing of those differences rather than acknowledging and accepting in a non-shaming, non-judgmental. It's like everybody is coming into the world and exists within it through, you know, different experiential background, to use the term lived experience, which I swear I love the phrase, so I'm going to keep using it in better ways than it's often being used. So, but that whole sense of each one of us brings the whole of who we are into every single situation. And if we try to, artificially separate pieces of us out, then you're not really helping. Well, for that matter, you're not helping build community, which we're both about. You're not helping understand people's perspectives, and then not helping them with their own growth, insofar as, they want to engage in it. So, which I'm sure is probably something you, I mean, as a peer counselor that you're, encountering.
Yeah. In fact, like some of us can't compartmentalize. Like even if I wanted
Hmm.
to, and that's like since I've moved to the Pacific Northwest, that's a lot of the pressure that I felt is to compartmentalize yourself. They talk about roles and boundaries and wearing hats. You'll hear peers talk about, oh, I'm not in peer mode today. I don't have my peer hat on. I have my admin hat on. I don't know what that is. I just show up as Jeff. I
Hmm.
have whatever's needed in the moment. I can switch. I'm not even switching between hats because I'm not even aware of the different hats. I'm just bringing my whole self to the problem. And I also want to say that despite being an outlier, and I know I'm weird to people, I know I've been a freak, I'm crazy, all that stuff, but I feel completely normal to myself. Like I have an internal
Hmm.
self-consistency and integrity that doesn't feel strange to me at all. I feel like I'm perfectly capable of contributing to society. I'm perfectly capable of integrating into the
Hmm.
mainstream. Most of my barriers are social. They come from how I'm perceived by other people. But to myself,
Hmm.
I don't feel that weird or different, or like I feel completely um whole in my own sense of being.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and I think that's it's interesting because I think so many people think that, or rather, I'll back up. So many people think that's how they're approaching other people around them, when in the actual practice, um, many people are in fact saying it, but then treating people from a perspective of parts. And this is where we get into issues around, prejudice and bias and so on. And sometimes there's not a moral component to it. Sometimes it's just how brains, certain brains will demarcate things, compartmentalize things. And it's just a matter of, oh, okay, nobody puts any added valuation to it. But the result still is treating people, um, like for yourself, like, oh, you're not Jeff, the whole person. You're Jeff, the gay man, or Jeff, the autistic person, kind of thing. It's just like, and then as a consequence, people will then treat you differently. And that's what I am hearing you, and what I try, hopefully to as much success as possible, to do with people as well is to not step into that, to consider the fact that yeah, we're all parts, but really in our felt experience, we're wholes. We're carrying every last piece of ourselves into every single situation,
Yeah, I
and
don't see how we
that's
can.
how we want to be treated. Yeah,
And you do a great
yeah.
job of that, by the way. So I think that's one reason that we were able to build a friendship in the first place, is because you do have that non-judgment and that curiosity of learning who the person is as a person.
No, well, thank you for that.
And
And
the
and
part about
that's
like,
and
is it tokenization like what you described, where I feel like sometimes I'm the
mhm,
symbolic representative of a group, and that's what I'm being treated at instead of as a person. And
yeah.
it arises from like labels, but the labels arise from observed behavior. Like people notice that I
Mhm.
speak a little differently than the people that they're used to hearing, or I move differently, or there's some little quirk about me, and then a label starts to form around that, and then the label becomes attached to me, and then that's where the tokenization starts, and I become the symbolic representative, like the tribal totem of that label. But underlying the labels is this authentic sense of difference. Like people are
Mhm.
experiencing actual differences with me. I just wish it wouldn't get encoded into these labels and start that process. I wish there were this more curious exploratory process like you demonstrated.
Well, and
That's
I
what I try
think,
to use with people when I encounter differences.
yeah, definitely. Well, yeah, and that's where, it's interesting because I think generally speaking, just we as a species, we create wholes out of parts. And so, we're conceiving of situations and the objects, whether or not they're inanimate or people and animals and so on, um, as we're experiencing them as wholes. But then if things are a little all awry, I was recently joked with that I was mispronouncing that, but it's like things go
Awry.
awry. The the weirdness of it, so called, which is a more of a moral judgment, but the weirdness of it is that, like, wait a minute, I'm used to A, B, C, D, E going in a certain order. And instead, I saw A, B, C. Oh, wait, D prime? Like, wait, what happened there? Like, there's some kind of like, there's an additional piece, maybe it's a lowercase d to probably bury this metaphor, but, it's like, we get into this where it's like, oh, something is different than what I'm used to. And then we have a choice. Either one, we can approach that difference with curiosity, with a genuine desire to go, huh, so my way of viewing the world based on previous experience didn't, big surprise, capture all of the ways that the world shows up. Maybe this is another, way of seeing things. Awesome. Let's see what's happening. And maybe it won't be great. Maybe it'll be, false in the sense that maybe I saw something that wasn't actually there. Who knows? But there's that open curiosity that so many, particularly in science, talk about. Or you can approach it as, well, this is an aberration, and difference means wrong, and difference means that I need to squash it or otherwise avoid it or put it in a brand new category in which I'm trying to say it's other. This is where the othering occurs. This is where what's that oft used phrase that, frankly, I think it's a little tiring because I think it's not entirely true, but in comic books and sci-fi shows where it's like people are afraid of what they don't understand. And it keeps being used because there is some truth to it. And this is that alternative way of looking at it. So you have this like open curiosity, and then you have this fear and othering, kind of thing going on.
Yeah, and I wonder what makes the difference. Does that come naturally to you to be curious? I'm thinking of the personality trait of openness, and maybe it comes down to temperament. Like
Yeah.
some people get
Hmm.
threatened by differences, and it provokes. It's overstimulating. They have to do this extra cognitive process to assimilate it, and they just rather not do all that. It's easier to just be defensive about it. And then maybe some people are wired to want to master the stimulus in front of them cognitively and understand it. And I don't know what makes the difference, but I definitely recognize the two types that you've identified. And I'm just wondering if, because it seems like you just have this natural openness and curiosity. And I've always felt the same. Like I don't have to work to be curious about something. I'm so curious. Like I wake up just
Hmm.
to know everything about everything. And maybe, is it hardwired into it? I don't know. I don't know why the
I
two
don't either.
types or where they come from. It's probably a spectrum or a range. I'm sure there's situations where
Yeah.
I do encounter differences and get threatened or defensive and don't go
Hmm.
through that process. But in general, my tendency is to want to understand and know.
Right. Yeah. No, and I don't know if it's, I get a little hesitant about hardwired because, the phrasing, because it's used so wrongly, in often, especially when I encounter it in clients or therapy circles where, it's like, oh, this is just hardwired, particularly when it comes to, diagnoses. And I'm like, it's not, it's not quite that simple. At the same time, I think you're right. There is uh, there's the big, five personality traits, and that openness being one of them is, I think, personality predilection. It's there is a baseline where if you had to, um, you know, you have a certain number of pre-built in or things you're built with, or born with rather, where you just come in and out of a say score of 100, your sense of openness is could be 30, so you're easily overwhelmed like you say, and you're like, I need to avoid more things, or you're at 80 and you're like, nope, new is awesome. Let's just keep on going. Not too much overwhelms me when it comes to things that are different. And then, of course, you have everything in between, or even more or less. And so, but then, of course, in the sense of like, you say epigenetics kind of thing, or this, social influences, we then get born into families and social situations and cultures that either promote that kind of baseline for us or knock it down and say, no, that's not appropriate. So, since in order, kind of recent news kind of thing, the whole Afghanistan debacle going on right now. I mean, here you have women in particular who may have, many of them going to school, studying science, studying technology, studying different ways of viewing the world. And, many of them may have been born with a certain predilection with openness and going, I like new. I want to explore the new. But now, as the culture has been shifting again, and a new authoritarian, regime comes in, and they're going to want to slap that down because they've added a moral judgment to openness. They've added a moral sense of, or to the desire to understand more, the desire to question, the desire to challenge, in fact.
My hope is that those people with the openness won't internalize that, first of all,
Hmm.
and second, that they will find an outlet for that anyway, which is what I did. Like I was always driven to it no matter what. I grew up in the rural South, and it was
Hmm.
more or less more authoritarian than not, and it discouraged question. Like they were irritated. It wasn't like oppressive, but people just irritated by intellectualism, by questions, by big word,
Hmm.
all of that. And so there was this general dissuasion from being too like my sister. I remember in school would purposely not make A's so that she could fit in. She would keep it at like a B or high C so that she was not perceived as too smart and could fit in more socially with her peer group. And I couldn't do like that. That's not my natural tendency. So I hope that the people in Afghanistan or anywhere that have that openness, I think some of them are going to be able to actualize it somehow anyway, just from this inner drive that
Mhm.
comes with it. And the ones that can or maybe are a little more, maybe little less experienced with openness or a little more uncertain about it, will at least not internalize the Taliban messages against it. And
Mhm.
that's what one thing I do with the people I work with is help them to not like to take the negative messages from the outside and not internalize them and somehow find something within to counter that.
Mhm. Absolutely. Well, and that brings up then, so, so you work as a peer counselor, and I mean, you work with anybody, but you have certain social niches that you tend to gravitate more towards. So how does that work for you?
I use
Obviously you've already mentioned a little bit, but
I usually end up with the people that nobody else knows what to do with. So when I was working psych, like inpatient psych, whenever they reached a client they couldn't handle, they would call me and like, go find Jeff. We don't know what to
Mm,
do this, but go find Jeff. Educationally, mental health wise, autistic parents that have kids that they don't know what to do with. They've tried everything. They've took them to 4 or 5 therapists. Call Jeff. Maybe he will have some kind of insight to the situation. That so I don't find my clients; they more or less find me, and it's after not having
mm,
been successful with the current options out there. Um, Most of my clients, probably close to all of them, and the autistic people I work with, they seem normal to me. Like I'm the people I find
mhm,
myself working with seem so normal, and I'm surprised at why the rest of society is having such difficulty or issues with it. So I never understand why they end up with me, because when they do end up with me, they seem fine. There seems very little barrier for me working with them. If you know trauma informed care, if you know neurodiversity or cultural diversity.
mhm.
So, I mean, I can only guess that the barriers are coming from within them, whether culturally or training wise or whatever. But how does it work for me? You asked. I don't know because it's
Mhm.
so natural and intuitive to me. It doesn't
Yeah,
really feel like work. It's
yeah.
just connecting. Like the
Well, and
basic
that's
is listening and connecting with people. If you can establish trust.
mhm,
Trust and transparency, those are the two magical ingredients for working with trauma. Transparency creates trust. So the more transparent you can be, and people that are traumatized, they know when you're being straight with them and when you're not. We can tell. So we know when somebody's
mhm,
being open and direct with us and when there's kind of games being played. And the more transparent you can be, the more trust you will build. When you build that trust, the more you're able to work with the person.
right. Well, I love that, the trust and transparency. I mean, it's when it brings to mind a little bit here, kind of connecting our couple of different topics here, but that working with trauma, I imagine that part of the transparency and trust building comes from seeing this person as a person who has experienced trauma rather than seeing them as a traumatized person kind of thing. It's like you are this whole being who has gone through varying degrees of awfulness and have kind of built some reactions to that in order to help save yourself, in order to deal with the repercussions of it to the best of your abilities at the time. And but you're still you. You're not, again, that whole parts and whole thing. And so, which then of course comes into trauma informed care. And I think so often people, and you hear this in some of the trainings, you hear this in some of the ways that the treatment centers will do it. It's like, in order to understand yourself the best, you have to delve into the trauma. Or I think the worst case scenario there is where if you are feeling off, if you're feeling disconnected, it must therefore mean that you had some kind of trauma in your background. So you go searching for it, as if the feeling of being different, or the feeling of disconnect from a particular social group or whatever, it can only be due to a traumatic experience kind of thing. So I don't know how much what you encounter with your clients, but
Well, there are different levels of trauma too. There's actual trauma. Like my
Mhm.
trauma comes from witnessing a very traumatic event. I watched the person I was closest to in the world die in the ICU in front of my eyes, and I've never been the same since. Like
Yeah.
my whole brain got shattered in the process. I had a very
Hmm.
bad experience with the guy I moved up here for. Same thing. Like my brain altered as a result of it. So there's trauma and then there's kind of the like the childhood trauma, like I've had trauma from childhood that I didn't even know was trauma at the time until I look back and can see how it impacted my development. But it wasn't the same kind of
Hmm.
trauma as watching somebody die or being in a relationship with a sociopath. And so I tend to
Hmm.
work with I try to get the trauma as specific as possible and work with the actual trauma, and then I can deal with kind of that more ambient trauma that we just accumulate from being alive and on the planet and leaving our house at some point. But I lost it. I had another thought about what you said. Oh, it there's always a person behind all of that. So, like, we have a saying in the mental health world:
Yeah.
people are not their symptoms, and I see almost nobody actually follow that. But if somebody is having a trauma reaction or is in a state of trauma or escalated or fight or flight or whatever, if you can't see the person behind that reaction or tune into the person kind of beyond or beneath that, then why don't even get involved in trauma work? Like this is not your
Hmm.
profession. That's one of the basic competencies you would need to do this kind of work. And one of the settings I was in recently, they hire a lot of young, mostly female, out of social work school that are scared of men. They're scared of emotion. They're scared of conflict. Why are these people being put in these inpatient crisis units to deal with homeless men that are angry, escalated on drug? Like it just seemed amidst like the skill set that's they're coming out of the universities with is not the skill set that it takes to work with this population. But this is the work that they want to do, they feel called to do, this is their profession. But they can't see any of they can't, I don't know what I'm trying to say. They don't seem to be able to see past the symptoms when they happen, like
Hmm.
on the job, when the
Right.
trauma symptoms start to get activated. I don't know, I lost it.
It's okay. Well, I think
I
maybe
think
we
I'm
can
trying to say
piggyback
too
on
many
one
things
another
at the
here.
same time.
No, I've often, yeah, get in the same situation. So maybe, so I'm hearing, there's difficulties with people being called to serve, and wanting to work with, certain populations, and not doing the due diligence in checking how you're viewing people in general. Even the whole conversation. Many are not aware of the assumptions about human beings, assumptions about particular sexes or genders or social situations, and they just enter it as if, well, I am here to care, and that should be enough. It's like,
I
it's
wish.
so not.
And it
Yeah, I
helps.
wish.
If but the
Yeah,
ones that are truly there to care, and some of them I didn't even find that. But I think if you're doing it out of a sense of I care and I want to help people, and you can communicate that to somebody in trauma, even if you have no other skill, that's a start. I mean,
true.
it's a small help, but I, I don't even see a lot of that really. It's
Yeah.
very mechanistic, technocratic, clinical. Healthcare is
Hmm.
becoming this way too. It's these very discrete interventions that you pull out of a textbook or recipe book based on the clinical presentation of a certain set. That's not the person. You're not treating the person.
Hmm.
You're treating a symptom.
Yeah. Well, and it reminds me a bit of, well, I mean, for that matter, we come into this with the debate on the, applying a medical model to mental health issues,
Mm.
and going, it's the uh, you know, beakerization. It's like if we can't put it in a test tube and we can put it under an electron microscope, then it's not real. And there aren't too many people, I think, that necessarily fall into that camp outwardly, but in their day-to-day dealings with, that's actually what ends up happening is going, well, like you said, okay, so here's this behavioral part, and here's this, and I can isolate a few others and therefore come up with a label to put on it, and that will allow me to then plug in particular interventions. And it's like people don't work that way. I mean, this is one of the reasons why we're having the so-called replication problem in so much of social and psychological research is because it's not that the people may have not found something legitimate in the first iteration of research, although sometimes they didn't, in fact, but maybe they did. But when rerunning it, there is a social thing that shifted that you can't account for in the experiment that you're running that influences the outcome, and suddenly it's like, well, now we're not finding this again. It's like that's not how any of this works, not at that level. These things are all interacting with one another in ways that are constantly shifting, and we can find baselines, sort of, but it comes back to the whole openness thing. You have, say, a baseline of a baseline of openness to new experiences, but even then, you have a window of that where you're okay with, say, if you're at a 50, you're good with going down to a 40, but you might be okay going up to a 60. But if it goes above that, even a person who otherwise would be really good with new experiences is going to feel overwhelmed. This is the whole thing behind introvert and extrovert. It has nothing to do with whether or not you like people. It has everything to do with your ability to navigate, information and experience and newness and in stressors. So people who are on the more introvert side, it's not that they can't handle new things. It's not that they can't handle social situations. It's just that the threshold is different. And if the threshold reaches, and even then there's a window. So some people will fall into this, and you're like, well, I'm generally okay with if I'm around 3 people, but you get to 5, and I start getting a little antsy. And then you add in loud music, and that all of a sudden amps it up. Then if you add in like, a siren going off down the street, and all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, no, this is too much.
Fireworks.
Whereas the person who's on the other end of the spectrum, who's suddenly classifying themselves an extrovert, they're going, whatever, give me more. You
Yeah.
can have an entire rock concert right next door, and I'm good. It's like it's just not going to matter. But it doesn't mean that even the extrovert might not reach a point where, nope, this is too much. Because everybody has windows of what they're comfortable with and what level of discomfort they're okay with dealing with. And it's just about exploring that and non-judgmentally, evaluating and being able to go, oh, okay, you've reached that level. Okay, well, here we are. What can we do to change this kind of thing?
It's funny you bring up introverts because we don't have them where I come from, or if we do, they stay in their house and you never see them. So that's a totally new personality type for me, and I am the plague of their existence. I am the rock concert next door in the house if I can have it. I
Yeah.
moved here from New Orleans, total extrovert
Hmm.
city. Introverts have a battery that
Yeah.
they have to protect it, and I blow out that battery in like 5 seconds, and I've used up their entire charge for the day for just basic interaction with me. So I have learned to kind of stay away from introverts and give them their space as much as I can so that
Hmm.
I don't affect them that way. But that's new to me. Like I've never been around people that have been that affected by conversation or noise or sound. Here in Seattle, they have this whole campaign against fireworks on the 4th of July, and we grew up
Hmm.
doing that. That's all fun to me. That's celebration and fun, and they make out like it's a moral issue for them. You're damaging your
Hmm.
pets. You're damaging small children. You're causing trauma to our psyches by setting off a firecracker. It's cultural, probably. I don't know. It's totally new for me.
Hmm.
But the extrovert and introvert polarity. There's two polarities that have probably plagued most of my existence, particularly the last 10 years, and that's male female, introvert extrovert. So if you have an introverted
Hmm.
female and an extroverted male together in the same room, you're asking for trouble. But I didn't
Right.
have that social range available to me growing up where I had experience like navigating those different times. And they didn't
Hmm.
either, like obviously. So this is something that we've all had to learn to do the past 10 years or so, the Pacific Northwest, since I've been here. Like people that
Hmm.
have interacted with, they've had to stretch what they're comfortable with and what they know is normal, and I've had to do the same thing. But I think that's valuable. I think if we're going to share the planet as humans,
Hmm.
we're going to have to do that. It's like Schopenhauer and the porcupines. We're going to have to navigate each other's quills if this is going to work. And we talked like
Right.
when you were describing the clinical stuff, it has its place, but it's very mechanistic. And we talked
Hmm.
about hardwired earlier, and that's a mechanistic metaphor. I don't
Hmm.
feel like I'm a machine. I don't have a sense of myself as a machine. I don't think other people are machines. And some of the culture up here seems to be people trying to be as much of a robot as possible, as much like a computer as possible, because that's the tech ideal of the human, the cyborg. And
Hmm.
that's too mechanistic for me. Like those tools don't work for the kind of work that I do. I don't find them useful in the arts. I don't find them useful for creativity. I don't find them useful for mental health stuff like trauma, neurodiversity. There's so many things that I find their organic model much more useful for. And so I think there's like the tension between organicism and mechanism has been enduring in our culture for centuries now, at least probably since the Enlightenment and then the Romantics came along in reaction to that. But you could probably
Hmm.
trace it back to the classical world as well. So I don't know where this tangent is going, but that organic
I don't
mechanistic
either.
like
Yeah.
worldview has been very helpful for me to understand my cultural experiences of the last decade from being up here.
Right. No, and that's a real, and I'm curious if perhaps that tension between the two and the desire to, so one philosopher that encountered a while back, Ken Wilbur, and
Oh yeah.
he, and, don't fully, fall into his way of looking at things because that's just true of everybody. But still, he's got an interesting kind of quadrant way of, analyzing all of experience, and you have this, deeply I, as he refers to it, phenomenological, where it's just like it's the lived experience, to use that phrase that people often are using these days. It's like it's just here's how I see the world. This is how I experience it. Then you have, so that's like the upper left, and you have the lower left where it's the we, it's the social. It's like, how do our communities, connect? How do cultures work? How do, familial dynamics work? And so there's this sense of, to bring in a little bit of, like, say, Daniel Siegel, the me that is we, this notion of I exist for sure, but it's an I within the we social constructs that are part of just the basic relationships that we all have. And and then for Wilbur, it's like, okay, well now, so you've got that, and that's where a lot of people will stop for their personal experiences. But he's noting that there's also a whole other column on the right where you have, the it and its kind of thing. And so, you already have the it where it's like it's the structures, the institutions that cultures will create. So you'll have everything from the American Academy of Sciences or the particular government structures that you might have, or even what is, the question of what is a proper family. What is, for instance, it's a topic that comes up with a lot of my clients, is like, well, what's the difference between a friendship and a romantic relationship? Well, those are all almost above, they're the it, it's the structures that we're kind of imposing and trying to figure out how we work within. And then you have the mechanistic, so the bottom right now, the it's, the actual buildings and the tools that we're using, and the infrastructure of streets and hospitals and so on. And we know this at an experiential level because we'll bring ourselves and feel a sense of difference if we walk into, say, a coffee shop as opposed to a hospital. Well, why are we feeling the difference? Well, because there is a real kind of collective, associations with these two different things, and so we will act a little differently depending on where we're walking into, simply because they carry with them, different ways of prescribed behaviors or different ways of thinking. Where we might have this kind of conversation over coffee, but odds are we're not going to have this conversation if we're, in a waiting room in a hospital.
You think
Maybe
so?
maybe we would,
You don't
but
think?
but generally, generally it might not happen. Yeah.
I would qualify that a little bit in my own experience, and maybe it's the autism, but if I walked into a coffee shop and it was full of cold introverts staring at their screen, giving everybody the stink eye that made the slightest bit of noise, and it was a hospital full of people that were laughing and cutting up and having fun. I used to work at a hospital, and let me tell you, we cut up. The fact that
True.
it's a hospital would not be the determining factor, and the fact that it's a coffee shop would not be. It's the social element that I'm picking up on, or that for me would
Mm-hmm.
communicate whether it's a Gemeinschaft or a Gesellschaft environment. And so
Yeah.
maybe people do respond to the structures and then conform, but I respond to the social, like the internal, the psychological or emotional or social energy that I'm getting more than the physical structure. And I don't know how true that is
Mm-hmm.
for most people, but that's what determines for me. Like I adjust to what I'm the social
Right.
read I'm getting more than what kind of setting it is. And I mean that's caused me problems my whole life.
Mm-hmm.
Like classrooms, I've treated other than classrooms, church, I've treated other than church based on what I feel like the people are there and the experience they're giving off. May be different from what the setting is
Right.
demarcated for.
Huh. No, and that's a good way of, possibly even drawing why communication difficulties come up, or why social difficulties at times come up. Like I'm thinking of, I remember almost the evolution of the coffee shop where, and this is of course depending on where you're at. because so
I
I grew
was
up in the
told that
Midwest,
Seattle
Michigan.
created the modern coffee shop culture originated in Seattle. That's what I was told in
Yeah,
the 90s.
yeah, I'm pretty certain that's true. I mean, Starbucks was definitely. I mean, they're almost synonymous with one another. It's it's kind of like when you're getting a moving truck, everybody refers to them as U-Hauls,
Oh yeah,
even though there's a bunch of other companies. You're like, oh, I'm going to pick up a
and
U-Haul,
Kleenex.
which has to be one of the most amazing marketing successes ever. But it's similar to so the coffee shop, and you go from here to somewhere else, and I've seen this evolution of where they kind of started with the louder, more social atmosphere. Almost reminds me a bit of the salon and philosophical salon in Europe, where it was like people got together and just, whew, let's figure out over probably not coffee all the time, but definitely more other libations. And so you're like, okay, we're going to figure out some deep conversations here, and and then now we started there, and then it got into almost like a library thing to
Yes,
some
exactly. I
people.
tell people all
Like
the
you
time
go
that
there to
coffee
study.
shops in Seattle feel like libraries. That's not normal to me. You
Yes.
don't go to a library or stay home. Don't come take your library and impose it on my social space.
Yep.
But I talk
Yep.
in libraries a lot
Although
too.
for that matter anymore, well, and anymore you walk into libraries, and now the libraries have almost in some ways turned into coffee shops, or what they used to be, where it's like you
That's
walk in,
why
you're like, how many people are talking in here?
I think the like
So
that's
weird.
the
So
social
yeah.
structure is the bottom. If it's a pyramid or whatever of importance, I think that's the
Mhm.
least important, and the actual social activity of the people there is more of a determining factor than the physical space, because they can change, like you said, people can
Mhm.
repurpose them, or reorient the atmosphere of them to encourage other types of activities than they were originally designed for. So I don't put, like, if I see
Right.
something that says library, or I don't ever assume it's prescribing one particular type of behavior or activity. I'm gonna more observe what
Uh-huh.
seems to be going on in that space and then adjust to like that present moment than a
Hmm.
label. But
So maybe the tension that, yeah, maybe the tension that exists for some people anyway is that between what is happening at the social level and what is assumed because of the structure that it should be.
yeah,
So I'm almost
maybe
thinking
so.
of
Yeah,
the
like
evolution of the family. It's like, oh, it's supposed to be this, and now I'm seeing all these people do
it's
this
so
crazy
interesting
stuff.
that you bring that up, because I get in conversations all the time where it seems like it's like, even in the work I do, I try to work on what's happening, like what is happening, what is actually happening in the moment right now in your life that we can deal with.
Mhm.
And a lot of people I find reference themselves to this cultural standard that they pull up that has nothing to do with what's actually going on right now, but it's really important to them to make sure that they're aligned with it, or that their child is aligned
Mhm.
with it. If your child's not giving you problems, don't worry. Like, what? Don't give yourself extra stress by like referencing him to some standard that he is or is not measuring up to if he seems fine in the moment. And
Mhm.
so I don't carry around that set of labels, or like, I'm always aligning or adjusting myself to whatever's happening in front. Like driving on the track, my car is adjusting to the conditions on the road in that moment. It's not also carrying how should I be driving if I were in New York City, and like aligning, making sure that whatever I'm doing
Mhm.
now is also aligning to some abstract standard that is not what I'm doing now. I don't know. It's like this double thinking that I see people do that I can't do. I can only do that
Mhm.
one track at a time.
Well, I have to say that sounds like I mean, obviously you have your own stresses from this way of thinking, but I have to say from this perspective, I'm just going, wow, that just sounds a whole lot more freeing. And I guess that's why I've actively sought to try to get there where, you almost you'll learn to identify here's what the structures are going on and then deciding whether or not you want to acquiesce or not. It's some of the work that I do with people is just like a thought can be just a thought in the sense that whether or not you want to give it greater weight or act on it in any particular way is a second step. It's a
Yeah.
second question to engage with. You can just simply rest initially on, oh, so I'm in a library right now. Okay, sure, a lot of things come with that, but do I need to, say yes to all of that? Well, now I'm going to read the situation and see what is being asked and or, what I'm, feeling like in a moment. Maybe I'm just in a rambunctious mood. But, it's like figuring out, like just being more flexible. This isn't carte blanche to be able to just do whatever the hell you want, but it is a kind of reflective practice.
Well, it allows for more self determination, and if you know anything about me, you know I'm really
Hmm.
big on self determination. And in fact, the kind of communities I'm trying to create are the kind that allow autonomous individuals to grow and develop as individuals, but still have a sense of community. So it's not a collective. It's a community of individuals that can remain individuals and still be in community with other individuals at the same time.
Hmm.
But I'm curious, so you have like these two layers that you carry on in your head that you're kind of shuttling.
Yeah,
Like I
often
probably
more
was
than
not
two, but
well
yeah.
socialized. You sound much like you were socialized properly or effectively. Whatever that process of socialization is that allowed that to develop, that didn't happen with me, and so I don't have
Mm.
that second set that. And I'm not like there's pros and cons to each, I guess, because I
Oh, yeah.
suffer many consequences from the way I was socialized or not socialized. But it also sounds like people that were heavily socialized, there's also some downsides to that too, perhaps.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, there's certainly, you carry around a bit more of a greater weight concerning assumptions about what is proper and right.
Oh yeah.
The number of people who, I encounter where, it's like, well, um, what's the right way of being in this? Or for that matter, I'm feeling A for this person. Therefore, doesn't that mean that I must engage in behavior B? And I'm just sitting there going, no, no, you don't. It's not a requirement here. It's you can rest on simply feeling and thinking whatever you're doing without the socialization that you've experienced to make that automatic connection. And we get this from books and movies and in social assumptions and so on that many anyway are raised with. Where and then you see it in I'm thinking primarily of relationships of the romantic kind, where you have so many people that are like, oh my gosh, I'm feeling X for this person. Does that mean we can no longer be friends because I have this feeling? No, what are you talking about? Or, I'm feeling this, therefore I must now, engage with this person from a romantic perspective or whatever. And it's like, no, the socialization there does not require, it may be telling you that this requires that, but there's no necessity behind it. You can feel love, for instance, for a friend and or even physical attractiveness to a friend. And guess what? it doesn't mean that you have to act on it in any particular way. You
Yeah.
know, I mean, it's just there's no requirement here. And this, of course, comes back almost perhaps bringing us full circle is, kind of looking at people as wholes and not getting so caught up in the parts. And in that sense, like I can feel a feeling that is attached to a particular piece of this person, but wait a minute, I need to stop and go, but I'm dealing with the whole here. So how do I want to relate to this whole person in front of me, not just this one thing? And there doesn't have to be a moral judgment there. It just has to be a recognition that, hey, you know, we have a lot of different ways to relate to one another. And
Yeah.
there's the flexibility, which is what I'm hearing you on the kind of the autonomous community, idea.
Yeah. Relationships are a great example, by the way, of something that I think is more effective organically than mechanistically. I think
Hmm.
relationships, the more organic they can be, I guess maybe the more, I don't know. I don't want to claim too much for it, but I think approaching relationships organically more than mechanistically will, the relationship itself, that will allow the relationship itself to take you to places that you may not get to if you try to mechanistically steer it according to some. I know what you describe as etiquette, like how do I behave
Hmm.
in this situation, or what's appropriate. They use the word appropriate all the time up here. Like I almost never heard that word before moving up here. And as an
Yeah.
autistic person, I avoid situations with too complex etiquette. Like I wish things had an etiquette
Mm.
rating. Like 1 dot or 1 star is about what I can handle. I'm really pushing
It would be
myself
that'd be nice.
with 2 stars. Don't put me at a formal dinner. Don't put me in a church where I have to act like. I'm very conscious of the etiquette level, and I don't have a lot of experiences in environments with high etiquette requirements because I avoid them, because I don't have the skill set to navigate them. And I tell people that all the time, and they still try to impose their sense of what etiquette level I should be at onto me. And so it's perfectly
Mm.
possible to go through life with a very low sense of etiquette if you kind of stay like niche build and stay in those niches where you can do that. So
Hmm.
this assumption that etiquette
Hmm.
is crucial to society and it's going to collapse if we don't use the right napkin or fork, that's one thing I challenge.
Well, I'll be right there with you. And I get a kick out of formal dinners. So yeah, no, it's still right there with you. Like this is, it's still like they're fun, but they're absurd, kind of thing. So,
And I'm too
but it's the
conscious of all
absurdity that I
the
find interesting.
absurdities. I can't hide them.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like we're at about an hour or so. That sounds like, man, that could take us a whole other hour. We could get
I
into
was about to,
relationships and etiquette and how all these things work.
David, I enjoyed this so much. I was about to say, like, I don't think we should stop at just one. I would love to invite you on our podcast and continue some of these threads.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Well, let's
Yeah,
make it
no,
happen soon.
I agree. We'll definitely, we'll put together a whole bunch of them, and then if people want to just, listen to them serially, then
Yeah.
we can set that up and just put that together. No, that'd be great. Thank you. This was fun. This will not be the last time we're going to chat
Oh, I
anyway,
hope not. I
let alone
thoroughly,
formally
thoroughly
like
enjoyed it.
this. So yeah, so cool. Is there so I'll put in links on the episodes and whatnot, but is there anything in particular, God forbid, social media handle that you,
I have
that
my
you can be
Twitter
followed
handle.
at or
It's at
awesome.
Primal Hex. I changed. Right now, I'm One Dreamy Demon. I used to be Seder Punk, but the actual handle is at Primal Hex. It's an old screen name, and right now, mostly it's the Discord. So if you want to find us, we don't
Hmm.
put the link out publicly because we don't want to be like bombed by random people. But if you contact
Sure.
me on Twitter, my email, can I say my email? Jeff.fullington@gmail.com. It's my first and last name.
Sure.
I can get you an
Hmm.
invitation to the Discord. You can find me on Twitter. I also have a weekly Zoom that I run, 11 a.m. Pacific time, 2 p.m. Eastern time, 7 p.m. British time. We're there every Wednesday. You can contact me for the link to that. The other way to find us is on the podcast. When we're doing it, we do it live, so you can interact in the comments, and we invite guests to hop on at the end and participate in the discussion if they want. So those are 3 or 4 ways to find us. And I guess someone could contact me or you if they wanted to be in touch.
That's also true. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, cool. Well, I will definitely put all those links on, and again, we will set up another time. We'll just keep this going.
I
It'll
would love
be
that.
it'll be fun.
I appreciate you so much for having me on. And I appreciate you.
Thank you. You as well, bud.
All right. Well,
Thanks. All right.
all right. Good luck.
Thanks.